I used to believe that the safest place in the world was the space between my son's voice and my own heartbeat. When Jason was little, he used to run down the hallway in socks, sliding into the kitchen and laughing so hard he could barely breathe. I built my entire life around protecting that laughter. I worked late, saved carefully, made sacrifices I never talked about, all because I thought one day he would grow into a man who understood what love looked like when it was quiet and steady. I never imagined that one evening I would sit across from him at my own kitchen table and feel like a stranger being negotiated with. The first time he mentioned planning for the future, I didn't think much of it. Children worry about their parents sometimes. That's natural. But the way he said it felt rehearsed, like lines memorized from someone else's script. He asked if I'd been forgetting things. He asked if I felt overwhelmed managing my house. I laughed it off at first, thinking he was just anxious. But after he hung up, I stood in the kitchen staring at the cabinets Daniel had built with his own hands, and something inside me felt unsettled. I tried to ignore it. I watered my plants, went for my morning runs, read novels late into the night. Yet Jason kept calling, always circling back to the same idea, simplifying, downsizing, letting someone help. Every time he said help, it sounded heavier than the last. I began to feel like I was being slowly pushed toward a decision I hadn't agreed to make. When he arrived for dinner with that leather folder, my chest tightened. He hugged me, but his arms felt stiff. Brittany smiled too brightly, her eyes scanning the room as if measuring something invisible. I served pot roast, the same recipe I'd made since Jason was a teenager, hoping familiar flavors might soften whatever tension had followed him through my door. We talked about the kids, about the weather, about nothing at all. But the folder sat on the table like a shadow waiting to speak. When he opened it, the air shifted. He talked quickly, explaining how everything was standard, how it would make things easier later, how he just wanted peace of mind. I remember watching his hands as he turned the pages, noticing how carefully he avoided looking directly at me. That was the moment I knew something was wrong. Even before I read a single line, I've spent most of my life reading contracts. Numbers, clauses, language that hides more than it reveals. As I scanned the pages, the truth rose slowly, like a cold tide creeping toward shore. Power of attorney effective immediately. Full control over my accounts. Ownership transfer disguised as a trust. Each sentence felt like a small betrayal stacking on top of the last. I kept my face calm because I needed to see how far he would go. When I asked questions, his voice sharpened. He said I was overthinking. He said I was being paranoid. Brittany stopped filming and watched me like I was ruining a performance she'd planned. The words theft and exploitation echoed in my head long before I spoke them out loud. When I finally did, the room fell silent the way it does right before a storm breaks. After they left that night, I stood alone in the kitchen for a long time. I touched the edge of the table where Jason used to do his homework, remembered the nights I stayed up helping him study for exams. The pride I felt when he graduated. I wondered where that boy had gone when he started seeing me not as a person, but as an obstacle between him and something he wanted. The next morning I called my lawyer. Speaking the situation aloud made it real in a way that hurt more than I expected. She listened carefully, her expression growing serious as she read the documents. Hearing her confirm that I'd been right felt like both relief and grief. Relief that I hadn't been foolish enough to sign. Grief that my own child had placed me in a position where I needed legal protection from him. Setting up new accounts, updating my will, changing the locks. Each action felt like closing a door I never thought I'd need to shut. Yet there was a strange strength growing inside me. For years I'd been the one who solved problems for everyone else. Now I was solving one for myself. When Jason called to apologize, I agreed to see him again because a part of me still hoped he would come back as the son I knew. I cooked spaghetti for the grandchildren, watched them chase each other across the backyard, and felt a flicker of normalcy. But as soon as we sat at the table, I saw the expectation in his eyes, the belief that I would eventually give in. Telling him I had already arranged my affairs without him was harder than I expected. The hurt on his face looked real for a moment, and I almost softened. But then Brittany spoke, her words sharp and dismissive, and I remembered the clauses that would have left me powerless in my own home. I realized that love without boundaries becomes permission for someone to take everything. When I told him he would no longer inherit my house, I felt something inside me crack. Not anger, not bitterness, just a quiet acceptance that the relationship we once had was no longer there. He accused me of choosing money over family, but I knew the truth was the opposite. I was choosing dignity over fear. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected. Mornings felt longer without phone calls about the grandchildren. Sometimes I caught myself setting an extra plate at the table before remembering they weren't coming. I let myself cry when I needed to, But I didn't let the sadness swallow me whole. I joined a book club, started painting small landscapes, and found comfort in routines that belonged only to me. My attorney's call about the guardianship claim didn't surprise me. It hurt, but it didn't shake me. Knowing that someone I loved could try to declare me incompetent felt like the final confirmation that I had made the right decision. I handled it the way I'd handled every crisis in my career, with documentation, clarity, and calm. Sometimes at night I replay old memories, Jason asleep on my shoulder during long car rides, Daniel's laughter filling the living room, birthday candles flickering while we sang too loudly. Those moments are still real. They didn't disappear just because the present changed. I hold on to them gently, like photographs that remind me who I was before everything shifted. Sending Emma her birthday card felt like sending a message into the dark, unsure if anyone would ever read it. I imagined her opening it, smiling at the glitter on the envelope, maybe wondering why Grandma wasn't there to hug her. That thought hurt more than anything else, but I refused to let it turn into regret. Protecting myself wasn't a betrayal, it was an act of survival. As the months passed, the house felt different, quieter, yes, but also lighter. I rearranged the living room, painted the kitchen walls a soft color Daniel would have loved, and planted new flowers along the walkway. Each change reminded me that this space still belonged to me, not just legally but emotionally. People assume strength looks like anger, but for me it looked like peace. It looked like waking up without fear that someone would try to take my independence. It looked like trusting my own judgment again. I realized that being alone and being lonely are not the same thing. Alone can be calm, intentional, even joyful. I still think about Jason. I wonder if he ever rereads the documents and feels ashamed, or if he tells himself a different story where he was only trying to help. I don't know if we'll ever speak again. Maybe one day he'll knock on the door without expectations, without papers, just as a son who misses his mother. If that day comes, I'll listen. But I won't forget the lessons I learned. The biggest change wasn't the legal protections or the new locks on my doors. It was the way I saw myself. For years, I defined my worth by how much I gave to others. Now I understood that boundaries are not a rejection of love. They are proof that you value yourself enough to protect what you've built. Some mornings I sit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and watch the sunlight move across the floor. The same table where I almost signed away my life has become a place where I feel stronger than ever. I paint there sometimes, messy colors blending into shapes that don't always make sense but feel honest. Creativity fills the silence in a way I never expected. When friends ask how I'm doing, I tell them the truth. I'm healing. Healing isn't dramatic. It's small decisions made every day, choosing not to reread old messages, choosing to go for a run even when memories feel heavy, choosing to believe that my story didn't end with betrayal. I don't know what the future holds, maybe reconciliation, maybe continued distance. But I do know that I'm no longer afraid of standing alone. I've learned that strength isn't about never being hurt. It's about refusing to let that hurt define your choices, sometimes late at night. I whisper Daniel's name and imagine what he would say if he were here. I think he would tell me he's proud of me for reading every line, for trusting my instincts, for refusing to surrender the life we built together. That thought gives me peace. The world keeps moving. Seasons change. Flowers bloom and fade. And here I am, still running in the mornings, still reading, still painting, still living in a home filled with memories that belong to me. I didn't lose everything when my son walked away. I lost an illusion. And in its place, I found something quieter but stronger, the certainty that protecting myself was not an act of cruelty, but an act of love toward the person I have become. The silence after everything happened didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, like dusk moving across a room. At first, I kept my phone nearby, expecting a message, a missed call, something that would suggest Jason had cooled down and was ready to talk like we used to. Every time the screen lit up with a notification that wasn't his name, I felt a small drop of disappointment settle in my chest. I told myself not to expect anything, but hope is stubborn. It lingers even when logic says it shouldn't. I filled my days with small routines to keep myself grounded. Mornings began with a run through the park near my house. The same path Daniel and I used to walk together felt different now, quieter, but not empty. Sometimes I passed grandparents pushing strollers, and a sharp ache would rise in my throat when I thought of Emma and Lucas. I wondered if they asked about me, if they noticed my absence at birthdays or holidays. I tried not to imagine Jason's version of the story being repeated to them, painting me as someone cold or unreasonable. One afternoon at the library where I volunteered, a woman around my age approached me after a financial literacy session. She told me her daughter had tried to convince her to sign similar papers. As she spoke, her hands trembled, and I recognized the fear behind her words. I listened carefully, guiding her through questions she could ask her lawyer, explaining how certain clauses worked. When she left, she hugged me tightly and whispered thank you. That moment stayed with me long after she walked out the door. It reminded me that my experience, painful as it was, could help someone else avoid the same trap. At home, I began sorting through old boxes stored in the hallway closet. Photographs, letters, small souvenirs from trips Daniel and I had taken. I found a picture of Jason at age 5, covered in paint, grinning proudly at a canvas he'd made for me. I sat on the floor holding it, feeling a wave of nostalgia so strong it almost knocked the breath out of me. I realized that grief isn't only about death. Sometimes it's about losing the version of someone you thought would always exist. Days turned into weeks. The house felt calmer, though occasionally too quiet. I rearranged furniture, donated items I no longer needed, and repainted the guest room in a soft blue shade. I told myself it wasn't about erasing memories, but about creating space for new ones. Each brushstroke felt like reclaiming a part of my life that had been overshadowed by fear. One evening, as I sat painting at the kitchen table, my phone buzzed. My heart jumped before I even looked at the screen. It wasn't Jason, it was an unknown number. For a moment I hesitated, unsure whether to answer, but curiosity won. A soft voice introduced herself as Emma's teacher. She said Emma had mentioned missing her grandmother and wondered if I might be willing to send a small note or drawing for a class project about family. My eyes filled with tears. I thanked her and promised to send something the next day. That night I wrote Emma a letter. I kept the words simple, telling her how proud I was of her, how much I loved her drawings, how I hoped she was enjoying school. I avoided mentioning anything about Jason or the situation because children deserve innocence whenever possible. When I sealed the envelope, I felt a sense of connection that had been missing for weeks. As the seasons shifted, I noticed changes within myself. The anger that had flared in the beginning faded into a quieter clarity. I no longer replayed arguments in my mind as often. Instead, I focused on what I could control, my choices, my peace, my future. Friends from my book club began inviting me to coffee after meetings, and laughter returned to my life in unexpected ways. One rainy afternoon, while organizing my desk, I found the certified letter I'd sent Jason weeks earlier. Seeing my own handwriting brought back the weight of that decision. I wondered if he had read it more than once, if it had forced him to confront what he'd done. I tried to imagine what he might be feeling, resentment, embarrassment, maybe even regret. The truth was I didn't know, and learning to accept that uncertainty became part of my healing. A few days later, my attorney called again. She told me there had been no further legal attempts from Jason or Brittany. Hearing that allowed me to breathe easier. I realized how much tension I'd been carrying in my shoulders without noticing. After we hung up, I stood by the window watching sunlight break through the clouds and felt something close to relief. I started planning a trip, something Daniel and I had always talked about but never had the chance to take. Researching destinations, reading travel blogs, imagining new landscapes gave me a sense of forward movement. For the first time in months, I felt excited about something that belonged entirely to me. Yet not every day was easy. There were moments when I'd see a family laughing together at the grocery store and feel a sharp pang of loneliness. Holidays approached, bringing memories of crowded dinners and shared traditions. I allowed myself to miss those things without letting the sadness define me. Missing someone doesn't mean you made the wrong choice. It simply means you care deeply. One evening, as I walked through my garden at sunset, I realized how much stronger I felt compared to the night Jason first brought those papers. Back then, fear and confusion had clouded my thoughts. Now there was a steadiness inside me, a quiet confidence that came from knowing I had protected myself when it mattered most. I began writing down my experiences, not as a formal record, but as reflections. Each page helped me process emotions I hadn't fully acknowledged: the betrayal, the love that still lingered, the hope that maybe someday things could change. Writing became another form of healing, a way to turn pain into understanding. Weeks later, while checking my mail, I noticed a small envelope without a return address. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was a child's drawing, bright colors, stick figures holding hands under a yellow sun. At the bottom, written in uneven letters, was Emma's name. There was no message from Jason, no explanation, just the drawing. Tears blurred my vision as I held it close. It felt like a quiet reminder that bonds don't disappear completely, even when adults make complicated choices. I placed the drawing on the refrigerator right next to an old photo of Jason from years ago. Seeing them together stirred a mixture of emotions: love, sadness, and something softer that I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was acceptance. As winter approached, I continued volunteering, painting, and building a life that felt balanced again. People often assume strength comes from big dramatic moments, but I discovered it grows in small decisions made every day. Choosing to forgive without forgetting. Choosing to move forward even when the past calls your name. Sometimes I imagine what I would say if Jason showed up at my door tomorrow. I don't rehearse speeches anymore. I simply know that I would listen, but I would also stand firm. Love doesn't require surrendering your boundaries. That lesson has become the foundation of who I am now. Late one night, sitting by the window with a cup of tea, I watched the moonlight stretch across the floor of my kitchen. The same room where everything began felt peaceful again. I realized that freedom isn't always loud or triumphant. Sometimes it's quiet, steady, and deeply personal, the feeling of being safe in your own life. I don't know how the story will end. Maybe reconciliation will come, maybe it won't. But I wake up each morning knowing that I honored myself when it mattered most. And as I move forward step by step, I carry both the pain and the strength with me, shaping a future that belongs entirely to the woman I've become. Winter settled in gently, the kind that didn't bring heavy snow but wrapped the mornings in a cool stillness that made the world feel paused. I found myself waking earlier than usual, drawn to the quiet before sunrise. The house would hum softly around me, the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock Daniel bought years ago, the faint rustle of tree branches outside my window. In those moments, I felt both the absence of what I'd lost and the calm of what I'd protected. The drawing Emma scent stayed on my refrigerator, and every time I walked past it, I felt a small warmth bloom in my chest. It was proof that somewhere, beyond adult arguments and misunderstandings, there was still a thread connecting us. I didn't know if Jason had allowed her to send it, or if she had done it quietly on her own, but I chose to believe it meant she remembered me fondly. My painting improved slowly. At first, my canvases were stiff, controlled, as if I were afraid to make mistakes. Over time, the colors grew bolder. One afternoon, I painted a small landscape inspired by a park Jason loved when he was little. As I worked, memories drifted in, him chasing pigeons, laughing so loudly strangers turned to watch. Instead of feeling sad, I felt grateful that those memories still existed, untouched by what had happened later. Friends from the book club began inviting me to dinners, and I learned to accept without hesitation. For years, my schedule revolved around family, around being available whenever Jason needed me. Now my evenings felt open, full of possibility. We talked about novels, about travel, about aging with dignity. I listened to stories from other women who had faced their own versions of betrayal or disappointment. And I realized how common it was for people to struggle with boundaries when it came to family. One afternoon, while sorting through mail, I saw Jason's name on an envelope. My heart pounded as I held it. For a moment, I considered leaving it unopened, afraid of what it might contain. But curiosity and courage pushed me forward. Inside was a short note, written in handwriting I recognized immediately. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He simply wrote that he hoped I was doing well and that the kids missed me sometimes. The message felt distant, cautious, like someone testing the temperature of water before stepping in. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after reading it. Part of me wanted to call him immediately, to bridge the gap that had stretched between us. Another part reminded me of the documents, of the pressure, of the way he had spoken to me that last day. In the end, I placed the note in a drawer and decided to wait. Healing required patience, not impulsive reactions. As spring approached, my garden began to bloom again. Tiny green shoots pushed through the soil, stubborn and hopeful. I spent hours outside, hands in the dirt, feeling grounded in a way I hadn't felt in years. Neighbors stopped by to chat, and laughter returned to my yard. I realized that my world had not shrunk after losing contact with Jason. It had simply shifted shape. One evening at the community center, after a financial literacy workshop, a young man approached me. He said he wished his own mother had stood up for herself the way I described during my talk. Hearing that made me pause. For so long, I had thought of my decision as something private, almost invisible. Yet to others it represented strength. That realization changed the way I viewed my story. It wasn't just about loss, it was about reclaiming voice. Weeks passed without another letter. I focused on planning my trip, researching places Daniel and I once dreamed of visiting. I imagined walking through unfamiliar streets, hearing different languages, feeling the thrill of being somewhere new. The idea of traveling alone used to scare me. Now it felt like a declaration of independence. One Sunday morning, while making breakfast, my phone rang with a number I hadn't seen in months. Jason's name flashed across the screen. My hands froze. For a long moment, I just stared at it, listening to the ring echo through the quiet house. When I finally answered, his voice sounded softer than I remembered. Almost uncertain. We spoke briefly. He asked about my health, about the garden, about the paintings I'd been doing. I kept my tone calm and polite, careful not to open wounds too quickly. There were long pauses between sentences, filled with things neither of us knew how to say. Before hanging up, he mentioned that Emma had an art project coming up and wondered if I might help her over video call sometime. The request felt like a small bridge being built, fragile but real. After the call ended, I sat by the window watching the afternoon light shift across the floor. I didn't feel triumphant or vindicated. I felt cautious hope. Rebuilding trust would take time. and I wasn't sure if it would ever fully return. But hearing his voice without anger reminded me that people can change, even if slowly. In the days that followed, I reflected on how much I had grown since the night he first brought those papers. Back then, I doubted myself, questioning whether I was overreacting or being unfair. Now, I trusted my instincts deeply. That trust became the foundation for every decision I made moving forward. The video call with Emma happened on a bright Saturday morning. She showed me her drawings proudly, asking if I liked the colors she chose. Seeing her smile filled me with a mixture of joy and ache, but mostly gratitude. Jason stayed mostly quiet during the call, letting us talk. When we said goodbye, Emma waved enthusiastically and told me she loved me. I held on to that moment long after the screen went dark. Life continued to unfold in small, meaningful ways. I hosted a dinner for friends, hung new paintings on the walls, and began writing short reflections about resilience. Sometimes I still felt the sting of what had happened, but it no longer controlled my thoughts. Instead, it became part of a larger story about growth and self-respect. One evening, as I stood in the kitchen preparing tea, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't waiting for an apology anymore. I wasn't waiting for anyone to validate my choices. I had already done that for myself. The freedom I felt didn't come from Jason's absence or presence. It came from knowing I had faced a difficult truth and chosen to protect my dignity. As the sun set, golden light filled the room, illuminating the table where everything had once felt so heavy. Now it felt like a place of calm reflection. I thought about the woman I was before all of this, careful, giving, sometimes too willing to trust. And I thought about the woman I had become, still loving, but stronger, clearer, unafraid to stand alone when necessary. I don't know what the future holds for my relationship with Jason. Maybe we will rebuild something new, something healthier. Maybe we won't. But as I stood there, listening to the quiet rhythm of my home, I understood that my life was no longer defined by someone else's expectations. It was shaped by my own choices, my own resilience, and the quiet courage it takes to read the fine print, not just in documents, but in relationships too.